everyone. My name is Geordie Wellerston. I am a lecturer here at the University of Sunderland in Social Studies and also a trustee for Report Out. So my job is really just to quickly introduce the talks, and I think we should jump straight in. We've got some fascinating talks for you today. So I'm going to hand straight over to Sarah, who will introduce the talk and topic. If you want to jump straight in. Yeah.
Oh, see some friendly faces. So some of you may know me, some of you may not. I am a lecturer here at the university. My background is, as an undergrad here, 20 odd years ago, physiology, then trained as a nurse, and then did some social science training. And the talk I'm planning on giving today really is quite a follow-on from some of the stuff that Mark has said in the earlier talk we just listened to. But I'm specifically focusing, rather than globally, on the UK and to some degree on the US in terms of history. There is an article that I'm writing that goes along with today, and I just want to quite quickly read a little bit of that abstract so that you've got an idea of where I'm coming from. The discourse that Mark mentioned appears to be focused primarily on issues of trans inclusion, arguments of perceived legitimacy, and or risk of given bodies and ways of being within public life in the UK currently. And in the presentation, what I'm going to do is trace some of the links between these exclusionary ideas that we're seeing re-emerging in the UK and specific events within British history. And there's a specific context around history. Much of the work that I'm doing currently is based on four historical thinkers: Michael Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Roy Barscott, who talked a lot about how science is done, and a philosophy professor in the US called Todd May. So what I want to do is ask you to keep a couple of things. You can tell I'm paraphrasing because of time. A couple of things in mind as we go through this. The question, and I'm going to come back to at the end. Given what we think we know, how might we live? It's a question that's part of my own ongoing research. Given what we think we know, how might we live? That question comes from Barscott and Deleuze, just talking. And also Professor Todd May, he made this comment a few years ago. Ontology, I'll explain that in a second. Ontology is, or ontological matters are merely historical matters clothed in ontological garb. What does ontology mean, technical term? It means being, existence. Okay? Without going into depth with that, because we'll be here till next Tuesday. So keep in mind, ontological matters, matters of being, are usually historical matters clothed in ontological garb, hence my title. Okay? So, without further ado, let's move forward. The legislative process. A lot of the stuff that we're seeing in the UK centers around the idea that transition is new and that trans people are somehow this new threat. And as anyone in the room, perhaps we might be today preaching to the choir. As anyone who's looked at these issues will know, LGBTQIA plus people, gender non-conforming people, etc. However we want to describe ourselves, we've been around for a very long time. So the legislative process in the UK goes back to at least 1861 and even further perhaps to the 16th century. The Offences Against the Person Act was when same-sex acts were criminalised to men. That wasn't changed till 1957 with the Wolfenden Report, which became the Sexual Offences Act 1967 that decriminalised those acts. Matrimonial Causes Act 1973, marriage is between a man and a woman. This is UK legislation. Then we had Sex Discrimination Act 1975, which has been since repealed for reasons we'll go into. Human Rights Act, as we're all very familiar with, 1998, the European Convention on Human Rights, and member states have to create some form of legislation coded into their national statute. The Sex Discrimination Gender Reassignment Regulations in 1999, which was in part responsible for the repealing of the 1975 legislation amendments. Then the Gender Recognition Act, 2004, the Equality Act of 2010, and the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act 2013. And none of these things came about by accident, unsurprising. But what's going on today? Currently, we're in the middle of post-Brexit Britain. And why is Brexit in a talk about trans people? Well, because it was all about borders. It's all about taking back control. Trans individuals, and indeed LGBTQIA plus individuals. More broadly, we challenge the idea of borders and boundaries, the way things are supposed to be done. And there was an emerging idea of Britishness and taking back our country from supposedly unelected individuals in foreign lands. Didn't go very well. Some people predicted such a thing. Didn't go very well. And it did hit the UK quite badly because globalization, economic globalization, is quite a strong force. Again, what's this got to do with trans stuff? Well, here we have some of the same media that sold the Brexit idea, selling the idea that trans kids are a problem. This ties into some of the stuff that Mark mentioned in the previous lecture around where the current culture war is and why is it trans kids are a problem. We'll come on to that, hopefully, if I don't run out of time. The Gender Recognition Reform Bill in Scotland was actually passed. Scottish Parliament, people must be aware of this, perhaps in the audience. The then Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, actually mentioned the term gender incongruence on the floor of the Scottish Assembly, and then very shortly after, passed at Westminster, the English Parliament went, no, you can't do that. Historic piece of legislation that said devolved democracy in Scotland was not able to do legislative process in terms of gender recognition, because apparently that would change some of the landscape of English law. Why and how? Case law is how we get legislation. In the top corner there, unfortunately, he's covered by the little video, but that is a chap by the name of Ewan Forbes Semple, 1967, 1968 in the Scottish courts. Ewan was born into a wealthy family that was very close to the Queen and very landed family. And when it came time for Ewan to inherit a male primogenitor estate, his cousin, very estranged cousin, challenged it because Ewan had been born effectively female and was what we would now recognize perhaps as either an intersex or a trans individual. The point of the inclusion here is because when it went before the Scottish courts, Ewan won his case and was allowed to hold the title of the 11th, he was the 11th Earl of Craigieville, baronetcy of Craigieville. That caused a bit of a constitutional problem because if a female person, someone born, shall we say, an assigned female, could inherit male lineage titles, the British establishment had a bit of an existential crisis. And the way that that judgment went down was via Scottish law, as something called the ad minical principle, something that's self-evident, but you can't necessarily say why it's self-evident. And for all practical purposes in social life, Ewan was male, was a guy, therefore he could inherit the title. That was the judgment. But around the same time, we had Corbett v. Corbett, which is a divorce case from Lord Corbett and April Ashley, a very famous actress at the time. And this was the one through Judge Ormrod that then created the legal situation where XXXY chromosomes came to define what maleness, femaleness was in law. The same scientific teams were involved in each case. The interesting point between these two is that the Home Secretary at the time of Ewan Forbes's case put what we now call a super injunction on it. It was not allowed to be in the public record. It was only actually brought into the public domain a few years ago by Professor Zoe Clayton, retired, who wrote a book about Ewan Forbes, on which some of my talk today is based. So it was the legal team for Corbett and Corbett were disallowed to, they were have you noticed when you're in front of a microphone, words will not come? Yeah, I do this for a living. I talk for a living. Yeah. So the legal team in Corbett v. Corbett were prevented from referring to the judgment in Forbes v. Forbes in public court. That vastly disadvantaged April Ashley's divorce proceedings. She lost her case because the marriage was annulled on the basis that at the time same-sex marriage couldn't happen in English law, and she was deemed male. This was then the case that, as far as the public is concerned, set the precedent for UK law. Fast forward a few years, Goodwin v. United Kingdom. This was the Christine Goodwin who went to the European Court of Human Rights because at the time the UK would allow gender confirmation surgeries, but they would not allow you to change your birth certificate and gender marker. We were one of only 2 countries that would do that at the time within the sort of European 32. So Christine Goodwin successfully challenged the United Kingdom in '92, and in 2004 we got the Gender Recognition Act. The UK, with its arm up its back, said yes, you can change your birth certificates to reflect who you actually are. B versus S Cornwall County Council. This was a employment tribunal situation where someone was pre-transition, post-transition within the same company, and they were treated poorly before, and they were treated better before the transition than after. So it was a sex discrimination case on the basis of perceived sex, and they won that in 1992, again European courts. Bellringer versus Bellringer in 2003 was legislation that brought about the Same-Sex Marriage Act because it was Mrs. Bellringer and their partner who again brought a European Court of Human Rights case against the UK government. And it was found that there was a contravention in terms of our right to marriage. So we ended up with the Same-Sex Marriage Act that was on one of the previous slides through Bellringer. Bell and Tavistock were getting a little bit more current. This was around healthcare, my area. Kira Bell, who ostensibly was not happy with her transition, and then it was used for someone else's culture war against the idea of trans-affirming care for younger individuals. Skipping forward a little bit because of the time. Mayor Forstater, this was again an employment tribunal. This was around free speech and the idea that gender critical views, we'll come on to that, are a protected characteristic. Belief is a protected characteristic, but what you do with it is not. So this is the sort of timeline, historical timeline around case law that's brought about, and it's not an exhaustive list. As I say, there are many, many cases. These are the ones that I picked out just to give a flavour of what the British legislative process has been going through for at least the last almost 100 years. We could go back further. Current media talking points. as Mark said, women and girls' safety, the history of the body, and its designed purpose. Mark was more explicit, mentioning theocratic ideas, religion. All of the stuff that is used against LGBTQIA+ stems from the idea that the body has a natural purpose, and that is therefore good. What has been called a naturalistic fallacy in the past. And then we've got this gender ideology. What is that? It's sort of this bogeyman that the culturally conservative are kind of suggesting is bad and wrong and is a problem. Yeah. But it also, gender really is a societal space that considers how sexed bodies are being used by their inhabitants, and also how they should be used and how we build society around it. Okay, differs from culture to culture, as Mark has mentioned. But what's actually going on in the UK then? I hope this video actually plays. IT have disappeared. Anyone? Jody, do you know how to click the video? Because I don't have a mouse. Has everyone seen it? Has anyone not seen Rishi Sunak's recent comments about trans people? Let's see.
It's not touch. Oh, no, it's not screen.
It's not touch screen, no. It's really. Yeah, it's out of battery. Okay, so well, I can skip ahead. Okay. Basically, what I'll do is describe it. I was going to condemn him with his own words. Oh, is it going to work? Oh, there you go. So I knew you'd know. I knew you'd know. Right, let's try it, see if it works. Oh, no. You say yes?
Yeah, just.
Is it going to work?
Yeah, it's still there at the top.
Is it? IT, making simple things complicated since 1985. Yes. I know we've got some IT professionals in the room, sorry.
Click on it.
Another thing, anxiety promotes memory loss. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I don't think it's going to work. It's not afraid. Yes. Out. Right. Well, for the sake of time, I'll not put you through that. Basically, the PM was quietly
Video support.
Video support.
We're on it.
Literally trying to just get the link to play. And it's not that one.
Do you want me to do a little dance in the meantime, just to distract everyone's attention?
I would make things complicated for myself.
I'll do Putin. I'll distract you all with things, and then blame someone else.
It's open in the background already. It's just we couldn't get
Right, it wouldn't share. It won't share because I wouldn't share particular thing.
Ah, right. It might be hard to go to. Sorry. That would be the one.
The women really had dealings with it. And I was reflecting, you all know I'm a big fan of everybody studying maths at 18. But it turns out that we need to focus on biology.
For a bit of an anticlimax, it's a very, very short video. Now do we start the next one?
You want another bit?
No. Just go back to the PowerPoint. So, as you heard there, our current Prime Minister suggesting that trans people are illogical because of anatomy. And obviously, self-evidently, particular anatomy goes with particular social characteristics. And yet the bogeyman, it seems to be identity. But with gender ideology, the bogeyman is identity, self-ID, but what our Prime Minister is talking about is biology. Why? And again, this comes back to the design for purpose arguments that we make in terms of religiosity. It's a fundamentalism that we see in policies that, in Adam Rutherford's rather colourful language, policies of eugenics, which are like a turd that won't flush. They keep coming back. I did laugh when I heard that in the audiobook. I thought it was a brilliant piece of writing. So why does this stuff come up? Where's the history? And I'll try and be brief. Mind-body problem, okay? The idea that mind and body are separate. Randall, Money and Green in 1954, they were in America and they started the idea of what became to know as gender dysphoria. Psychology and endocrinology were trying to battle for control of the access to transitional healthcare, and by extension, the socially accepted causalities of it. That's April Ashley in the corner there, the lady who was married to Lord Corbett and who lost her case in 1970. Around this time of her case, the symposium was going on in America, and it was the psychology side that won, and trans people were deemed to be mentally defective, less than, therefore not to be trusted. Now today we have Mental Capacity Act and other things, so that people are deemed to have capacity unless proven otherwise, but we were socially pathologized, psychosocially pathologized. So we then started to see in Charing Cross this idea come across into the UK, and social engineering and breeding out of these sort of undesirables. We'll start to be a British idea. I'm not suggesting that they were good, it was a good approach, but that was the underpinning thinking. There's a very famous book by Janice Raymond in America that kind of started this off. And really, you can't talk about the UK situation around trans inclusion and trans recognition without talking about America and without talking about these two people, Reagan and Thatcher, certainly for the latter 20th century. Because it was around this time that Thatcher made her famous speech about pretended families and the inalienable right to be gay that preceded Section 28. Local government. Schools were not allowed to talk about people who were different. The rainbow family did not exist until you were 18 and above. Age of consent laws were different if you were gay or straight. And around the same time in America, 1979, the Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond was written, and that was used in part for policy. Now, I did know what NCHCT stood for, but I can't remember because I've stood in front of you. And it's basically their health authority. I can't see the notes that I have, copious notes on the other screen. I usually present with a double screen. It's their health authority, and it was policy in America, healthcare policy in America. And Janice Raymond was an ethicist, not a scientist, an ethicist. And she said the best thing to do about transsexualism, transgenderism, was to morally mandate us out of existence, to make it difficult to do the transition of health. Because it's all based on their idea of ethics, which ties back to naturalisms, the proper use of proper bodies. Ruth Pierce, 2018, wrote a book called Understanding Transgender Health, Trans Health. And what she says, it's a position I quite like, transgender, transsexualism is the older term, both a social group as a movement and a condition, aka diagnosis. Free will and choice are things that, in terms of liberal societies, we all subscribe to. The freedom to be ourselves, to come out, to be authentic. But when we talk about things like diagnosis, what we're talking about is the framing that underpins what that choice means, whether it's social psychosis, psychopathology, or whether it's something else. And what Peirce calls a repertoire of possibility, in a repertoire of possibilities, trans people exist at the junction between social care, healthcare, diagnosis, and social recognitions, between possibilities of the human body and permissions that are given to the human body. Why we're doing all of these talks now, and why Britain is having an existential crisis, Britain's constitutional elite are having an existential crisis, because of a change in international, I would suggest it's because of a change in international healthcare governance. Well, the World Health Organization, WHO, changed its international classification of diseases with effect from January of 2022. It published from the 10th, went from the 10th edition to the 11th. For those that don't know, the 10th edition was published in 1990. It was the edition that removed homosexuality from the healthcare literature. ICD-11 tried to do something for trans people, but they didn't want to go down a full demedicalization route because some countries will simply say, well, we're not going to pay for your healthcare. Yeah? If there's no socialist healthcare system based on free appointed delivery, then if you just make transition personal choice, it then becomes nothing other than lifestyle. That was the risk inherent. So what the World Health Organization decided to do was they said, well, trans people have the right to self-determine their own difference. And we were reclassified, recategorized, think of categories and identities, as part of the human variations that had previously been considered around intersex. And therefore, the cause, if you like, of transitions was not psychological wrongness, error, just it was an affirmation of someone's difference and possibility. Of course, what this then does is it undermines everything that patriarchy and binary purpose-driven bodies and purpose-driven reproduction is based upon. So this is why the existential crisis. British healthcare, British governments did not want to do this. The government at the time wanted to keep trans people within a psychopathologized box. And that's why, as people have mentioned, we had so much problem with conversion therapy practices. Because on the one hand, if you're a genuine trans person, you're going to have all the affirmative surgeries. On the other hand, personal autonomy. The definitions of why people transition and what it is that's causing them to do it were very, very different. And it was a bit of an existential crisis within the higher echelons of government. And I talked a bit about identities and categories. What I want to do very, very briefly, because I'm running out of time rapidly, is to just highlight that words are not the things that they categorize or describe, okay? We'll skip through this. Bisexual used to mean intersex about 150 years ago. Sex, in the bottom corner there, we know that that's a noun and a verb, and that also has a big bearing on how these discussions go down. When people are talking, mostly when trans people are talking around sex, we're talking about the noun. When trans skeptics, so-called gender criticals, are talking about sex, they're talking about the verb. So the use of words and what they're being pointed towards is sometimes how these arguments get muddy. Attraction, and the word that's hidden there is orientation. Attraction, that biophysiological stuff, and orientation, the direction of travel. but we talk about sexual orientations. In order to have an orientation, you've got to know where you're coming from, right? And where you're going to. But if you have an attraction, that says nothing about who you are. It says everything about what you are drawn towards. Yeah. So there are different ways of considering these arguments. Hasn't really translated across onto the screen very well, but words, concepts, people. Okay. This has a trigger warning on it. I'm not sure if the graphic will work particularly well, but if we're not careful, words and people, like trans, and some of the words that are about to come up that are very unpleasant, become sort of the way people are thought about. One of our delegates mentioned the altercation they had just in the earlier presentation. And it's people's idea of what it means and what trans means that is creating this hostile environment. Because when you hide the concept, yeah, that should say trans in one big box. When you hide the concept bit in the middle, words and people get smushed together. And then all these words on the side become what people think being trans is. Remember history and ontology? What things are and what they're thought to be. Now, if we back up a little bit from the theory stuff, when we're talking about social policy that comes from governments, provision, distribution of resource, and healthcare, which is itself linked to the idea of what it means to be human and existence, are all dependent on the value structure that we see up here. Yeah? Ideology in terms of government. And it's no surprise when you've got a PM that will quietly take mickey out of trans people that their ideology is not favourable to us. Citizenship depends very much on all of these different things. And there is a book, I'm trying to remember the author again, Imagined Communities, Nationalism. Nationalism is the thing that we're really fighting here, the idea of what it means to be British. What it means to be British and how British value structures, where it is at this side here, maybe in terms of proper bodies, is infecting or affecting where people are deemed to have citizenship be included. Some authors have talked about sexual citizenship. How do we include people that have diverse lives? And what does it mean to be a citizen? Certain rights are conferred upon us. Without citizenship, no social agency, no choice, and you can think social agency, quality of life. So we have a bit of a policy paralysis. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through. We're stuck in the middle of these three, between these three different things that are part of the human condition. And really what we've got is the government suggesting that it's impossible to transition. You can't do that. Men are men, women are women, because they have certain anatomy. End of, sorted, because reproduction is the reason, the raison d'etre, the reason we are here. But we all know that that's very reductive. Yeah? And biology is anything but simple or basic. I said my first degree was physiology. Okay? Variation is the very thing that brings human being into life. 9 months to cook a baby. It's a complicated recipe. Anyone try to make bolognese? Yeah, you want to try and make a baby? I mean, yes, make a baby by all means. Yeah, as long as straight people keep making babies, stare quotes here, then we're fine. But every time a baby is born, that baby has the potential to be different because variation happens. And variation is that which leads to evolution. We all know this. If sex was binary, then Sexuality in terms of attraction, remember attraction orientation is different, would also have to be binary, which means that being LGB would be a choice only, cognitive at best, yeah, pathologized at worst. So when people like Joanna Cherry stand up and say that trans people are a threat to LGBT people, they're missing the point, because they're thinking about legal protections rather than what this argument is actually about, not identities, biodiversity. Progress Pride flag. Anyone seen the Progress Pride flag? We've got the intersex bit in the newest version, if you like. Biodiversity is coming to the fore, and that's what gives established social structures a bit of an existential crisis. It was asked in one of the earlier lectures, what could we maybe do if we looked in the mirror? Yeah? I think what we're all guilty of is thinking liberalism is the way forward. Political liberalism, live and let live. The problem is you can't argue with fundamentalists. So we need to outwit them and say your basis is wrong. Sex never has been binary. It's always been a multivariate process and an assemblage of multiple qualities and properties. I'll skip ahead because of time to a diagram I want to show you. To this one. If sex was binary, you'd get this male and female histogram. A bimodal distribution. Scientists love this kind of stuff. Two normal distributions. Let's say this is height. And you've got height there, male and female. Okay, and there will be an overlap. And you can do this for pretty much any what we call sex-linked trait. These bar charts would be where the averages are here. Simple maths. Okay, because a normal distribution is around an average. And what we sometimes see is this from evolutionary biologists or evolutionary psychologists that ask what is on the x-axis, which is a 0 there. Now, if anyone's done A-level statistics, you'll know this doesn't stack up because the average here for height is there and there. This is not an average. This is not a normal distribution. What's on this horizontal axis? Variation. One is not female and then has properties because one is female. One has properties and then is deemed to be female. The reason we have a bimodal distribution here is because we measure that property of male and femaleness in terms of this stuff on reproductive capacity. Yeah? And obviously, if you measure for reproductive capacity, it's one quality. So to look at these arguments here, and as Colin Wright, who I took this from, suggested, saying that males and females are not a continuous variable, you commit yourself to suggesting that the category, the identity, is a singular thing that exists in nature before any variance. In other words, you separate the possibility of variation across the piece and then suggest that intersex people can't exist. It is bad science, it is bad statistics, it's bad maths, it's technical term bollocks. Yeah, utter bollocks. People get uncomfortable when there's a trans person who is invested in transgender rights and variation and free will and liberalism, all of that stuff. People get uncomfortable when people talk about sex. But it is biology and the idea of sex and its purpose that is keeping this pendulum swinging in the wrong direction. It's not identity, or at least it's not an individual identity. I would suggest to take the idea of what it means to be British, imagined communities. And that's worrying. Yeah, this is Robert Sapolsky, who's a Harvard professor of behavioral biology. Humans think in categories. And what we're seeing is that our illustrious leaders are not thinking. They're not thinking, they believe the category is self-evident. categories become thinkable, as Rosie Braidotti says, at the moment of their dissolution. I'll skip forward on this one because we're out of time. It's a little bit too academic. What we do see, unfortunately, is an erosion in support because this campaign that is happening in the UK at the moment of misinformation and this idea of the natural is creating a toxic environment, as we heard earlier on. So people that are generally supportive on a liberal front, politically liberal front, are starting to drop off. This is worrying as a trend. If we do not fight the actual problem, which is biodiversity, then this is going to continue. The pendulum will keep swinging to the purposive end, and we'll end up in a situation where we're very, very close, if we're not already there, to fascism. Yeah? A fundamentalist idea of biology that is linked very closely to fascism. And I don't drop the F word lately. Did anyone see Mahari Black in the comments when she said we were talking about fascism? Google it. It's a great speech. Yeah. Great speech. Unfortunately given to a nearly empty house, but a great speech. 1 in 4 Britons, yeah, only 1 in 4 reject any form of transgender status. So we do have support, but it is waning because of the constant onslaught of trans skeptic, transphobic stuff in the media. There's something daft like 12 or 13 articles in one of the Guardian papers a couple of Sundays ago, and we are 1 to 2% of the population. You know, why is it that 1 to 2% of the population is such a threat? Yeah, we can't spread so thin that there's every one of us in the toilets. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Yeah, that's not going to happen. So there's something else. It's not the physical body that is an actual threat, but the idea of the body that is a threat to an established system. Yeah, is this making sense? Yeah. Anybody scared yet? Don't have nightmares. Right? Anyone used to watch Crime Watch? Crime Watch? Those of us that are one generation don't have nightmares. Yeah? Because one of the other presentations that I'm doing is on trans joy, and that's the way that we combat this by our support. Incidentally, I mentioned about conversion therapy, conversion practices. My colleague John Riley Dixon and I had an article published in Therapy Today recently that dealt with that very thing on this basis. And we have another one hopefully coming out very soon in the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy. So hopefully this question will get more attention. What we can't do is assume that liberalism will do the work for us. That people who are just generally, happy for live and let live, will do the work for us because they're not invested. And you can see here from the last 10 years, the International Lesbian, Gay, Transgender Association, the European sort of watchdog, if you will, they publish a rainbow index every year for the whole of the European sort of estate, and they grade each country on the basis of a percentage point of how inclusive it was. We had first place 2013-14 with 82%, and now look where we are, 53%, 17th place. All pretty much because of this argument around transgender legitimacy, around whether or not biodiversity exists, what it means, and what threat it represents. Yeah? How people should have proper bodies and use them properly. Politics, everybody hates this stuff. Okay? So we're about here somewhere. Cultural individualism, corporate stuff going on. We are in danger of sliding further up towards the top. People tend to think that trans inclusion is a lefty issue. Is it? Is it? society and civilization. Margaret Mead was asked what was the first sort of sign of civilization, and she replied, a healed thigh bone. Has anyone heard this story before? Yeah? Why was it a healed thigh bone? Do you remember? Not letting someone die. You can't heal your thigh bone without help. If this breaks in nature, the state of nature, Thomas Hobbes and all those thinkers, you're dead. End of, because of the amount of blood that you're going to lose, and you can't walk. What happens with that bone is if it breaks, it does this. And you've got to apply traction, so someone's got to pull on it. And to heal, you have to be looked after. That was the first evidence of early civilizations for anthropologist Margaret Mead. There's a few other authors, can't bring their names to mind, and they said that you'll judge a society by how it treats its least and lesser. Those that have no power. Make no mistake, trans people don't have a great deal of power. We might have a great deal of resilience, because we don't have much choice, but we don't have much power in the current arguments. And judge the cultural cleansing that's happening on that basis. This is just, hopefully, this is sort of my last two closing slides. Hopefully, with those questions that I said at the outset, given what we know, how might we live? And thinking about arguments of being and existence in terms of historical clothing, historical context, hopefully today in that whistle-stop tour has given you a bit more context. Some of you will be very familiar with these arguments, some of you may not be. Okay? It's a different spin on the usual freedom and liberty arguments, all of which are very, very valid, but all of which depend on this stuff. Yeah? Foundational ideas of human being and human value. If we include trans individuals within society, we would necessarily include their healthcare, their legitimacy, and their value to society as a whole. In other words, see them as entirely human, not an exception to the human condition, as this government seems to be intent on doing. So, in closing, given what we think we know, how might we live, is important, because what we or others think is possible or impossible in and around the idea of sex very much will affect our lives and other people's lives. And on that basis, we need to start thinking about the scientific stuff as well as the political stuff, and seeing these arguments for what they are. Theocratic, absolutism, and what you might call neo-fascist approaches to society. For those that are supposedly gender critical, I would suggest that is a clouding of the issue, and they are effectively trans-skeptic. The transition is impossible, and it's identity only, social only, because they have a particular view of what biology is and what it means. On the back of this, just because I didn't say it during time, and I know I'm going to run over, some of the arguments around trans healthcare, we don't have an effective trans healthcare system in the UK. The narrative is that we're transing kids too fast. Yeah? But people are waiting in some cases up to 19 years for a first referral. So what the current UK government is doing is stealing time from trans people. They're stealing time and stealing lives. But I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to leave it there, open the floor to questions, and thank you all for indulging.
We have permission to make a little bit of background noise as the fresh tea and coffee coming. Once the questions happen, is that okay? Just very brilliant. Thank you. And just a quick announcement to everybody. We have renewed timetables because JJ gave us a good reminder earlier. 2 of our talks this afternoon were cancelled, so please redirect yourself to any talk you want to go. They are being handed out now by Jordan, so you'll all have a copy.
Does anyone have any questions at all? I was a very whistle-stop tour and a bit of a condensed version of what I had planned, and I went with no safety net because I didn't have my notes. All right, so I hope it makes sense. Yes, at the back.
That was great to be reflecting. I was just wondering.
Yes.
So I have to finish in the game. I grew up in Scotland. I was born in Scotland. I identify as British.
Yeah.
So I'm not very strong cross national.
Yeah.
When I heard that, and I was the march, it really struck me that exactly what was going to happen, and that's actually what was about to struck the time, but I haven't really thought about it in terms of kind of a big line that goes through our country, and actually it wasn't about trans rights, it was about recognizing trans people and arguing to say, look, Westminster is ignoring our rights to legislate, we're supposed to be pro parliament, blah 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 as well. But it was just interesting. I was wondering what you thought about that in terms of that. So how much of that was about trans people and how much of that was about making a point about the legislative landscape in Britain that goes on between both.
Great question. I think three things I want to say. Gender dysphoria and gender incongruence are different in kind. First was psychology. It's a bit like a heart attack. It's like giving someone angina medication just after they've had a heart attack. Okay. Prevention is better than cure. So gender incongruence is the newer term, but it's early intervention stuff to prevent the harm of late intervention transition. It comes from new knowledge, etc. So the two terms are different kind. Nicola Sturgeon used the gender incongruence, which means she looked at WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Standards 08. And that's the standards that the UK government doesn't want to apply. Okay? And obviously WHO's. In terms of Scottish devolution, well, if self-identity is a problem on an individual scale for Westminster, self-determination difference, devolved power is pretty much the macro level, political level of self-ID, self-determination. They can't allow self-determination on the individual scale. How are they going to allow self-determination for government? In Scotland, when it goes against the entire structure of British law, English law, should I say, English law, because the admonical principle from human forebears gave us a constitutional problem in terms of inheritance from the landed gentry. Yeah? So I think alongside bodies, we have a power issue. Yeah? This is about who has control over who gets to be what. And healthcare, we have issues with intersex, historical issues with intersex care, where trans people and intersex people, they are an intersecting group. They're not Venn diagrams that don't overlap. But we've had different problems on the same issue because young intersex people had surgeries done to them without consent. Trans people are trying to get healthcare, whether it be HRT or surgery, depending on what they individually need, and they can't have it. So stuff done on the one hand without consent, the other one not being done, even though you give consent. And the whole issue is control. The whole issue is control of power and who gets to be what. So it's a battleground over the human being, the ideas of human being, human bodies. When Nicola Sturgeon said gender dysphoria, I realized her days were numbered. Because you notice with the GRR, it didn't go to royal assent. It was blocked, section 35. We've just had a change of monarch. And did anyone notice what happened with the Church of England? Not long after King Charles took the throne, the Church of England rolled back to protect its inclusion policies on same-sex marriage. So Charles is not a reformer, and if you have to get royal assent for a gender recognition bill that's going to change the law regarding inheritance and primogeniture, it's not going to happen. Yeah. So shall we call it the 1%, the landed gentry to circling the wagons? It's not about our individual freedom, it's about them at that level holding on to their power base. Yeah. Was Nicola Sturgeon politically removed? That would be conjecture. But the timing was extremely interesting. Yeah? Does that answer your question?
We don't know them.
We don't-
know what's going on with Nicholas.
We don't know. Do we ever know anything about politics? Because the truth is out there, but they never tell us, right? The truth is whatever they want to say to get them elected. Okay? So maybe that's a little simple, but we're never really going to know. I think there was an issue there that they leveraged. Yeah, for other reasons. Anyone else got any other questions?
Do we have access to this presentation?
We can make it accessible.
I'm sure. I'm quite happy for people to have it yet. There's a ton of sort of notes, bits and pieces. I'll put some references on over. It might take me a week. I'll put all the references, bits and pieces on it, and I'll happily make it available in terms of that stuff. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah.
So, perspective of the truths, politics, sense of the concept. I wanted to ask what you said about the chromosomes.
Yes.
The legal case about what's happened to that? Is that still stand, or is the Gender Recognition Act something displace that somehow?
It's a fudge. It's a fudge because what the law has done is they've used gender to give rights to trans people and sex in terms of legal stuff going on. They're going into the past because law can't be said to contradict itself. In colloquial language, we use gender and sex interchangeably, but in legal stuff, there's a subtle difference. And I think the Bellringer and Bellringer case did change that landscape slightly, but Lord Altrod made his judgment on the April Ashley case, the Corbett v. Corbett, solely based on XXXY. And if you read the case notes of the Forebears judgment, that was deemed to be the least important bit, because of course it's not universal. We have XXXY, we have double XY, we have a number of variations. I think the most common ones are about 5 of them. So it's not universal. There isn't a single measurable, universalizable trait or quality that defines male and female. So we don't have a male or female gene, we don't have a gay gene, we don't have, but what we have is an assemblage of multiple factors, biological and sociological, that result in a person. And so it's this process of variation. And what the law is really struggling with is how do we conceptualize it? And I think we have people saying now that we need to clarify the term sex in law. And they're talking about biological sex. But the problem with that is itself open to interpretation. Remember, words and things. So we have this, the idea of objectivity and measurability that is a problem in law, because people that are doing these sort of interpretations of the discourse around politicians, I don't want to say they're uneducated, because they're plainly not. So they're not going to see the philosophical problem, because that's not where they're going. Even though most of them get to Oxford and done PPE, I think they maybe drop the philosophy class after utilitarianism, and that's it, it's done. Yeah. So there's a battle to be had on that. Yeah. If you want a personal opinion, I think we do need to clarify this, because if we get those arguments right, we then unequivocally state in law that LGBTQIA people and all that rainbow family of variation are part of the human condition, not the exception to it. That's the main thrust of what I'm getting, and the main thrust of my work. And how we go about that in law, I'm not a legal scholar. Good luck to those who are. Okay, I think there is a conversation to be had there for sure.
Sarah,